Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
They never showed up for me. Not once. Not for my graduation, not for my birthday, not for a single damn moment that should have mattered to them. But now, they expect me to pay for Ryan's wedding? Yeah, they've lost their damn minds. It started with an unexpected phone call, the kind that makes you stare at the screen for a few seconds before answering, debating whether or not you even want to deal with whatever nonsense is about to come your way. My mother's name flashed across my phone, a name I hadn't seen in months, maybe even a year, because our conversations were never anything more than obligatory holiday check-ins and occasional guilt-tripping messages about how I never call first. I almost let it go to voicemail, almost ignored it the way I had learned to do over the years, but something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe just a twisted sense of obligation, made me pick up. "Jack, sweetheart, how are you?" My mother's voice was filled with the same fake warmth she used whenever she wanted something, the kind of forced enthusiasm that was a little too sweet, a little too rehearsed, like she had practiced sounding excited to hear from me. I leaned back in my chair, already exhausted just from hearing her voice, already bracing myself for whatever she was about to ask. "I'm fine, Mom," I said flatly, waiting for her to get to the point. She wasn't the type to call just to check in, and we both knew it. I could hear her inhale sharply, like she was trying to sound casual, like she wanted this to feel like a normal conversation between a mother and her son, instead of whatever manipulative nonsense she was about to pull. "Well, I have some wonderful news," she finally said, dragging out the words like she was announcing something that actually involved me. "Ryan's getting married." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of those words settling over me like a brick to the chest. Ryan. Of course. It was always Ryan. The golden child, the perfect son, the one they had showered with attention and praise while I had been left to fend for myself. "That's great," I said after a beat, my voice void of any actual excitement. "Tell him congratulations." I was already thinking of ways to end the conversation, already preparing to hang up before she could say what I knew was coming next. And she continued, her tone shifting slightly, turning just a bit too casual, just a bit too forced. "Since you're doing so well for yourself, we figured you could cover the costs." I actually laughed. It wasn't a joke, but it might as well have been because there was no way she had just said that to me with a straight face. "You figured what?" I asked, leaning forward now, my free hand tightening into a fist against my desk. "You know how much weddings cost these days," she sighed, like this was a burden she was carrying, like this was hard for her to ask. "Ryan and Emily have been dreaming of a beautiful ceremony, something truly special. And well, you've been so fortunate in your career. You just thought I'd pay for it?" I cut her off, my voice sharp, my patience already wearing thin. "Are you serious right now?" Her tone changed instantly, the false warmth disappearing in an instant, replaced with something colder, something harsher, something that told me she had never expected me to say no. "Jack," she said, her voice suddenly tight with irritation. "He's your brother. Family helps family. He would do the same for you." That was the moment I actually felt my blood boil, the moment I had to close my eyes for a second and take a breath just to keep myself from saying something truly unforgivable. Because Ryan would never do the same for me. Ryan wouldn't even pick up the damn phone if I needed help, wouldn't even pretend to care if I was struggling, wouldn't even acknowledge that I existed unless it was convenient for him. "That's funny," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "because I don't remember him offering to help when I was working 3 jobs just to put myself through college. I don't remember you offering either." There was silence on the other end, just long enough for me to know she remembered exactly what she had done, exactly what they had chosen to ignore, exactly how little they had ever supported me. But instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging the years of neglect, she just sighed like I was being difficult. "Jack, that was a long time ago. We did what we thought was best at the time." I actually laughed again, this time with nothing but bitterness, nothing but years of pent-up resentment finally bubbling to the surface. "Right," I said, shaking my head. "And what you think is best now is using me as your personal ATM. That's not fair," she snapped, her patience finally cracking. "You're being selfish. This is Ryan's wedding. It's a once-in-a-lifetime event. Do you really want to look back and know you refused to help your own families?" That was it. That was the moment I realized I was done. Done pretending we had a real relationship. Done hoping they would ever treat me like I mattered. Done letting them walk all over me just because it was easier than fighting back. "You want to talk about regrets?" I said, my voice calm in a way that should have scared her. "You want to talk about looking back? Let's talk about how you never showed up for me. Let's talk about how you missed every important moment in my life." Let's talk about how you weren't there when I needed you. But now you expect me to be there when you need me. Jack, she started, her voice suddenly softer, like she could sense she was losing control of the conversation. But I didn't let her finish. I owe you nothing, I said, finality laced into every word. Tell Ryan good luck with the wedding, but I'm not paying for a damn thing. And with that, I hung up, my hands still shaking, my heart still pounding, my entire body filled with an anger that had been waiting to be unleashed for years. What if I told you this wasn't the first time they tried to take from me? What if I told you this was just one of many? Because trust me, this story is just getting started. Hanging up that phone should have made me feel victorious, should have given me some sense of satisfaction, should have felt like a moment of power. But instead, I sat there in silence, my fists still clenched, my heart still pounding, my mind racing with every single memory I had spent years trying to bury. Because this wasn't just about the wedding. This wasn't just about Ryan. This wasn't just about money. No, this was about something much deeper, something much more painful, something that had been building inside me since the day I was old enough to realize that in my family, I would always come second. I thought back to my childhood, to the times when my parents' absence in my life wasn't just emotional. It was literal. They weren't there for my school plays, for my baseball games, for the nights I stayed up sick and needed someone to hold my hand. They weren't there when I won a spelling bee in the 3rd grade and looked out into the audience, expecting to see them, only to be met with empty seats. But Ryan? Ryan was a different story entirely. My mother practically lived at his soccer practices, sitting on the sidelines, cheering him on like he was a professional athlete. My father, a man who could barely be bothered to have a full conversation with me, took entire days off work just to drive Ryan to out-of-town tournaments, acting like his future depended on kicking a ball into a net. When I graduated high school, I remember standing on that stage, my diploma in hand, scanning the crowd in a desperate, hopeful panic, searching for even the slightest chance that they had bothered to show up. But they hadn't. They never did. My parents were too busy helping Ryan pack for some weekend trip with his friends, too caught up in his world to even remember that their other son was achieving something significant. Meanwhile, Ryan's graduation? Oh, they threw him the biggest party the neighborhood had ever seen, complete with a catered dinner, decorations, and a ridiculously expensive watch that they had saved up to buy for him. That was the first time I truly realized how little I mattered to them, but it wasn't the last. When I turned 18, I had one goal: to get into college and build a future for myself, one that didn't involve constantly being overshadowed by Ryan's endless parade of achievements, real or imagined. I had a small college fund. Nothing huge, but enough to give me a decent start. I had spent years believing that it was set aside just for me, that even if my parents weren't emotionally present, they had at least done something to help me get ahead in life. But then one day, just a few months before I was set to start classes, I found out the truth in the worst way possible. I had gone to the bank, excited, ready to finally start planning, to take control of my own future. I had filled out all the necessary paperwork, had all the numbers written down, had everything mapped out in my head. But when the banker pulled up my account, his expression changed immediately, shifting from polite professionalism to something uncertain, something apologetic, something that instantly made my stomach sink. It looks like the balance is zero, he had said, his voice careful, hesitant, like he didn't want to be the one to tell me that my entire future had just vanished into thin air. Zero. Not a dime left. Not a single dollar remaining. Gone. Every single cent. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. I knew there had been money in that account. I knew there had been savings, years of deposits, enough to at least help with tuition. So I did what any panicked teenager would do. I called my parents, demanding an explanation, demanding to know where my college fund had gone. And my mother, without a hint of guilt in her voice, without even pretending to be sorry, simply said, "Oh, we had to use that money for Ryan's new car. You understand, right? He really needed it. Ryan's car. My entire future, my entire shot at a better life, my only chance at breaking free from their neglect had been sacrificed for a damn car." I remember standing outside the bank, gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might crack, listening to my mother talk about how I could just take out loans or find a way to make it work, as if I hadn't spent my whole life watching them hand everything to Ryan while expecting me to fend for myself. That was when I truly understood my place in this family. That was when I realized I wasn't their son. I was their backup plan, their afterthought, their resource to use when it was convenient for them. So I did exactly what they expected me to do. I found a way. I worked 3 jobs, scraping together just enough money to pay for classes, living on cheap food, sleeping less than 4 hours a night, pushing myself harder than I ever should have had to. Meanwhile, Ryan partied his way through college, living in a fully paid-for apartment, driving around in the car that had been bought with my stolen college fund, enjoying every luxury my parents had handed to him without a second thought. And now, after all these years, after all the sacrifices, after all the nights I spent barely making ends meet while they poured everything into Ryan, they had the audacity to call me and ask me to pay for his wedding? I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head as I sat back in my chair, the rage simmering inside me like a fire that had been waiting years to burn. This wasn't about the wedding. This wasn't even about Ryan. This was about a pattern, a lifetime of being overlooked, of being treated like I was less than, of being used and discarded whenever they saw fit. And the worst part? They genuinely thought I would just go along with it. They expected me to open my wallet, to write a check, to fix everything like I always had. But if they thought I was going to be their personal bank, they had another thing coming. Because this time, I was going to make damn sure they felt what it was like to be left with nothing. The moment I realized just how deep my family's entitlement ran, something inside me shifted, something sharp and cold and calculating that I had never allowed myself to fully embrace before. They had spent years using me, expecting me to sacrifice, assuming that I would always be the one to step up and take care of their problems. But this time, I wasn't just going to say no. I was going to make them regret ever thinking they could take advantage of me again. So I did something they would never expect. I pretended to agree. It wasn't easy, keeping my voice steady when I called my mother back, forcing warmth into my tone as I said, "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. Family helps family. I'd love to contribute to Ryan's wedding." There was a moment of silence on the other end, just long enough for me to know she had been expecting a fight, long enough for me to enjoy the way she stumbled over her words before finally responding. "Oh, sweetheart, I knew you'd come around." Her voice was dripping with satisfaction, like she had won, like she had successfully guilt-tripped me back into my place. But she had no idea that I was already planning to turn this entire situation into their worst nightmare. The first thing I did was get the numbers. If I was going to destroy this wedding before it ever even happened, I needed to know exactly what they were expecting me to pay for. I asked casual questions, pretended to be interested, acted like I was just excited to help out, all while mentally tallying up every single outrageous expense they wanted me to cover. The venue? A luxury estate that cost more than a year's salary for most people. The catering? 5-star, plated dinners for over 200 guests. The honeymoon? A 2-week trip to Europe, fully paid for, because apparently, the groom's family was supposed to handle that. I nearly laughed out loud when my mother cheerfully said, "It shouldn't be more than $50,000. Like that was a completely reasonable number, like that wasn't the kind of money that could buy a car, pay off student loans, or put a down payment on a house. They didn't just want help with the wedding. They wanted me to pay for all of it. But the real fun began when I decided to meet Ryan's fiancée, Emily, and I quickly realized something surprising. She had no idea they were expecting me to foot the bill. I had assumed she was in on it. Assumed she was just another entitled, spoiled brat who thought the world owed her something. But the moment I casually mentioned the cost of the wedding, the moment I jokingly said, "Well, I guess I better start writing those checks," her forehead creased in confusion, and she tilted her head like she had just misheard me. "Wait," she said slowly, setting down her coffee. "What do you mean? Your parents are paying for everything, aren't they?" And just like that, I knew I had found my first real advantage. I played it off like I had simply misunderstood, waved my hand, and changed the subject, but my mind was already racing, already piecing together how I was going to use this information. Emily wasn't expecting me to pay. She was expecting Ryan's parents to cover it, which meant they had been lying to both of us. They had convinced Emily's family that they were handling the wedding costs, while secretly planning to dump everything on me, fully expecting me to shut up and pay. But the real gold mine came a few days later when Emily mentioned something that made my entire plan fall into place. We were talking about the wedding, about all the planning stress, about how much pressure she was under, and then completely out of nowhere, she sighed and said, "At least the prenup is sorted, so that's one less thing to worry about." My entire body went still. I set down my drink carefully, schooling my features into something neutral, something casual, before saying, "Oh, a prenup?" Emily let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, my dad insisted on it. Ryan wasn't thrilled, but in the end he signed it. We just finished all the paperwork last week. Ryan signed a prenup." Ryan, the man who had never done anything unless it benefited him. The man who had spent his entire life skating by on the generosity of others. The man who had never been held accountable for anything. He actually signed a legal document that would prevent him from taking half of Emily's money if they ever got divorced? No, he hadn't. I forced a smile, nodded along like I wasn't already formulating my next move, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. Ryan wasn't the type to agree to something that didn't benefit him, wasn't the type to sign away financial security without a fight. So, later that night, I did what I should have done from the very beginning. I started digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, because Ryan was just as sloppy and arrogant as I remembered. His entire life was scattered across social media, his financial habits laid bare for anyone willing to look. And buried in the mess of gym selfies, overpriced vacations, and pictures of him holding expensive whiskey bottles was exactly what I had suspected. Ryan never signed the prenup. The moment I saw the messages between him and his friends, messages where he bragged about stalling Emily's lawyers, about how he was just waiting until after the wedding to handle it, about how he wasn't about to let her screw him over, it took everything in me not to call Emily right then and there. Ryan had secrets, and I was going to expose them. They thought I was just going to pay for their wedding. They thought I was just going to be the good son, the responsible brother, the one who always took the fall. But they had no idea that I was already setting fire to everything they had built. The moment I found out Ryan never signed that prenup, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that one piece of information wasn't enough. If I was going to take him down, if I was going to make sure this wedding imploded before it ever had the chance to happen, I needed more. I needed proof that Ryan wasn't just a selfish, entitled brat. I needed something that would make Emily run for the hills before she made the biggest mistake of her life. So, I did the one thing I had never done before. I started digging into my brother's life. Ryan had always been reckless, always had a way of burning through money like it meant nothing, always had our parents there to clean up his messes. But the deeper I looked, the worse it got. I started small, looking through social media, checking old posts, scrolling through comments, but that wasn't where the real dirt was. No, the real dirt was buried under layers of denial and secrecy, hidden beneath the surface where our parents had been shoving it for years, pretending it didn't exist. It didn't take long to find exactly what I was looking for. Ryan wasn't just bad with money. He was drowning in debt, loans, and unpaid bills so deep that I had no idea how he had managed to hide it for this long. Credit cards maxed out. Personal loans overdue. Gambling transactions buried in his bank statements, hidden under vague charges that anyone who knew better would recognize instantly. He wasn't successful, wasn't responsible, wasn't half the man he pretended to be. He was barely keeping himself afloat, and our parents were covering for him every step of the way. But the real bombshell wasn't the debt. No, the real bombshell came when I dug deeper and found the thing that would destroy his relationship beyond repair. Ryan had been cheating, not just once, not just a drunken mistake. No, Ryan had a history of cheating, a pattern of lying, a trail of other women that stretched back years, long before he had ever proposed to Emily. And the worst part? Our parents knew. I found old messages, late-night calls, shady transactions linked to hotels, and expensive gifts that weren't for Emily. And buried in those messages, hidden in the mess of excuses and pathetic justifications, was proof that our parents had been helping him cover it up. They had always known who Ryan really was, had always known what he was doing behind Emily's back. But instead of calling him out, instead of holding him accountable, they had helped him lie, helped him hide it, helped him sweep it under the rug so his perfect image wouldn't be ruined. That was when it really hit me, just how deep their favoritism went, just how much they were willing to sacrifice to keep Ryan's golden child image intact. They would rather go broke covering for him than admit they had raised a failure, would rather let him ruin someone else's life than acknowledge they had spoiled him into oblivion. I could have gone straight to Emily then and there, could have dropped every single piece of evidence on the table, could have blown up the wedding in an instant. But I didn't. Not yet. Because Emily wasn't just going to take my word for it. She needed to see it for herself. So instead of handing her everything, I started planting seeds of doubt, slowly, carefully, making sure she started asking her own questions before I handed her the answers. It started small, subtle, things I knew would get stuck in her head. I mentioned Ryan's financial stress, acting like I had assumed she already knew about it, watching as her face twisted in confusion. He told me everything was fine, she had said, and I had just smiled, letting that thought simmer in her mind, letting her start to wonder if he had lied to her. Then I started mentioning names, old names, women I knew she wouldn't recognize. I ran into Sarah the other day. I had said casually, watching as she blinked, tilting her head. She and Ryan used to be really close, right? The way she froze told me everything I needed to know. Ryan had never mentioned to Sarah. By the time I was done, Emily was already suspicious, already second-guessing everything she thought she knew, already starting to unravel the lies on her own. Meanwhile, my parents were doubling down on their pressure, pushing harder than ever, trying to trap me before I had the chance to completely burn this wedding to the ground. My mother called me constantly, acting like we had already agreed on everything, pretending like my role as financial savior was set in stone. Then, at a family dinner, they outright lied to people's faces, telling guests that I had generously agreed to cover all the wedding expenses, spinning some ridiculous story about how proud they were of me for stepping up as the older brother. I had to fight the urge to laugh in their faces, had to hold back from calling them out right then and there, had to let them keep digging their own graves while I sat back and watched. Because the deeper they went, the harder they lied, the worse the fallout would be when the truth finally hit them like a truck. They thought they were winning. They thought I had given in. They thought I was under control. But they had no idea what was coming next. Because you won't believe how far they went to get my money. I had been expecting them to push harder, expecting them to pull every manipulative trick in the book, expecting them to lie and guilt trip and twist reality until they got what they wanted. But I still wasn't expecting this. I wasn't expecting them to go behind my back and steal from me again, wasn't expecting them to have the sheer audacity to reach into my pockets without permission, wasn't expecting them to rob me blind while still pretending to be the victims in all of this. I found out by accident, scrolling through my bank statements one night, double-checking my finances like I always did, making sure every single penny was accounted for. I wasn't even thinking about them, wasn't even worried about my money because as far as I knew, I had locked them out of my accounts years ago, had taken every possible precaution to keep them from pulling the same stunt they had when I was younger. But then I saw the withdrawals, small at first, just a few hundred here and there, nothing big enough to raise an immediate red flag, but enough to make me pause. And then I saw the big one, a $5,000 transfer that had been processed just days earlier, disappearing into an account that was suspiciously familiar. My parents, they had taken my money. Again. At first, I thought maybe I had made a mistake, maybe I had forgotten an old account, maybe there was some kind of banking error. But then I saw the details, saw the transaction history, saw the name on the receiving end of the money. My father's account. I sat there, staring at the screen, my blood running ice cold, my hands gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. I felt a slow, burning rage creep up my spine, hotter and heavier than anything I had ever felt before. They had done it again. They had gone behind my back, stolen from me, taken my hard-earned money without even having the decency to ask. And the worst part? They had planned this. The reason they were so confident, the reason they kept telling people I had already agreed to pay for Ryan's wedding, the reason they never seemed worried about how I would respond. They had already taken the money, had already decided for me, had already helped themselves to what they thought was theirs. They must have used old banking details, account numbers I had forgotten to update, security measures I hadn't realized were still connected to their names. They had gotten in somehow, siphoned money from me like it was their right. And now they were sitting there probably celebrating their victory, thinking they had outsmarted me, thinking they had won. But they had no idea what I was about to do next. I didn't call them. I didn't confront them. I didn't yell or demand my money back because I knew that would get me nowhere. No, I escalated my plan instead. First, I went into my accounts and closed every possible loophole, making sure there wasn't a single place left where they could access my money, making sure they were completely locked out of my finances forever. Then I went into our old shared account, the one they had access to, the one they used to send me money when I was younger, the one they had stupidly never removed my name from, and I quietly transferred every remaining dollar out of it. They had left several $1,000s sitting in that account, money they probably thought they were safe to use, money they had no idea was still legally tied to me. And without hesitation, without a second thought, without a shred of remorse, I drained it down to zero, leaving them with nothing but overdraft fees and a rude awakening when they checked their balance. Let them feel what it's like to have something stolen out from under them. Let them panic. Let them wonder how it happened. And then, I took my evidence straight to Emily. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't dropping subtle hints, wasn't giving Ryan the benefit of the doubt, wasn't letting this play out slowly like some drawn-out revenge fantasy. No, I was finishing this now before they could do any more damage, before Emily ended up legally tied to a man who was nothing more than a cheating, lying, financially unstable disaster waiting to happen. I met her at a coffee shop, sitting across from her, watching as she smiled, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her life. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't ease her into it. I simply pulled out my phone, opened my carefully organized folder of screenshots, bank statements, messages, and proof, and slid it across the table toward her. "Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I need you to see something before it's too late." She frowned, looking down, scrolling through the first few images, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, Then from shock to something much darker, something much colder, something that told me she was starting to put the pieces together in real time. Ryan's debt, Ryan's gambling problem, Ryan's years of cheating, proof that my parents had known, proof that they had helped him hide it. And then, the final blow, the message Ryan had sent to his friend, bragging about never actually signing the prenup, laughing about how he was just waiting until after the wedding to fix the situation. Emily didn't say a word for a long time, just sat there, staring at the screen, her hands gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, finally, she took a deep, shaky breath, lifted her head and met my eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't seen this before the wedding." I nodded, knowing this wasn't over yet, knowing there was still one final scene left to play out. Because the wedding was still happening, and Ryan had no idea what was coming for him. And if you thought this was satisfying, just wait until you see what happens at the wedding. The morning of the wedding arrived, and the air was thick with the kind of tension that only comes before a storm, before something irreversible happens, before someone makes a choice they can never take back. My parents had no idea what was coming, had no clue that their perfect little plan was about to blow up in their faces, had no way of knowing that I was about to dismantle everything they had worked so hard to keep hidden. And Ryan? Ryan was standing at the edge of a cliff with his arms wide open, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to push him off. I arrived at the venue early, walking through the lavish decorations, the expensive floral arrangements, the ridiculous display of wealth that I was never supposed to be able to afford but had somehow been expected to pay for anyway. My parents were already there, greeting guests, shaking hands, putting on their perfect, well-practiced smiles, pretending to be the gracious, generous hosts they had always wanted people to believe they were. My mother saw me first, her face lighting up with something that almost looked like relief, like she had genuinely believed I would cave in at the last second and somehow magically agree to save them from their own mess. "Jack," she beamed, pulling me into a hug that I did not return, her voice dripping with fake warmth, her grip just a little too tight, like she was trying to keep me from slipping away before she got what she wanted. "I'm so glad you're here. You look wonderful, and I just wanted to thank you again for..." "Save it." I cut her off, my voice calm, controlled, already brimming with the chaos I was about to unleash. "Let's just get through the day, shall we?" I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the slight hesitation in her expression, the brief moment where she questioned whether or not she had actually won. But she let it go, let me walk past her, let me slip through the crowd without another word, because in her mind, the battle was already over. She was so wrong. I spent the next 2 hours waiting, watching the pieces move, making sure everything was lined up perfectly before I set the match to the gasoline. I waited until everyone was seated, until Ryan was standing at the altar, until Emily was standing just outside the doors, until the guests were settled into the illusion that this wedding was about to go off without a hitch. And then, right before the ceremony was set to begin, I made my move. I pulled out my phone, opened the email I had spent days crafting, and with a single tap, I sent it to everyone in attendance. Family, friends, colleagues, even the wedding planner. Within seconds, the entire venue was filled with the sounds of phones buzzing, messages being opened, gasps of shock, and whispered conversations that grew louder by the second. I had sent everything. Screenshots of Ryan's financial ruin, proof of his gambling addiction, the receipts from the money my parents had stolen from me, the text messages proving they had been covering up his cheating for years, and the final, devastating blow, the messages where Ryan admitted to never signing the prenup, laughing about how he was just waiting until after the wedding to lock himself into Emily's money for life. The reaction was instantaneous. Emily's father was the first to stand, his face turning a shade of red I had never seen before, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body shaking with rage as he turned toward my parents. "Is this a joke?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmuring guests like a blade. "You knew about this? You knew, and you let my daughter walk into this?" My mother went completely pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, completely caught off guard, completely unprepared for this level of public humiliation. My father, who had spent his entire life acting like he was untouchable, looked like he was on the verge of collapsing, his entire face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the nearest chair like he was trying to steady himself. And Ryan? Ryan was frozen at the altar, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal, like he was trying to calculate whether or not he could lie his way out of this. But there was nothing left to lie about, nothing left to spin, nothing left to salvage. Because Emily was already walking toward him, her wedding dress trailing behind her, her face unreadable, her hands clutching her phone so tightly I thought she might crush it. She stopped in front of him, lifted her chin, and in a voice so quiet yet so deadly, she said, "I would rather set myself on fire than marry you." And then, without another word, she turned around and walked out of the venue. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Ryan didn't move, didn't try to chase after her, didn't say a word. Because what could he possibly say? That it wasn't true? That he didn't mean it? That he could fix this? He had nothing left to say. And me? I wasn't finished yet. I stepped forward, turning to face the guests, turning to face my parents, raising my voice just enough to make sure everyone could hear me clearly. "Since we're all being honest today," I said, my tone mockingly polite, "I just wanted to take a moment to say that I was never going to pay for this wedding. I got my money back, and as of this moment, I am officially done being this family's bank account." My mother let out a choked gasp. My father looked like he was about to pass out, and Ryan just stood there, staring at the wreckage of his perfect day, completely, utterly ruined. Guests started getting up, leaving, whispering amongst themselves, shaking their heads, throwing disgusted glances at my parents, whispering about how humiliating this was, about how they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. And me? I just turned, walked out the same doors Emily had walked out of, stepped into the fresh air, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt free. But if you thought this was the end, oh no. My parents weren't done yet. I knew they wouldn't go quietly, knew that my parents would never simply accept what had happened, knew that they wouldn't just let me walk away after completely obliterating their perfect little illusion. But I still wasn't prepared for the sheer pathetic desperation that followed, the way they scrambled to rewrite history, to shift the blame, to pretend that this was somehow all my fault instead of a direct result of their own greed, lies, and selfishness. It started the very next day. I had barely even woken up when my phone began buzzing relentlessly, message after message pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. My mother, my father, even Ryan, all of them grasping at straws, trying to regain some kind of control over a situation that had already slipped entirely out of their hands. I ignored the first few calls, let the messages pile up, let them sit in their own mess for a little while longer. But eventually, curiosity got the best of me, and I made the mistake of answering one of my mother's calls. "Jack," she gasped the second I picked up, her voice thick with manufactured distress, as if she had spent the entire night crying over what I had done to them. "How could you do this to us? To Ryan? To your own family?" I almost laughed, almost burst out laughing right there on the spot, because the audacity of this woman was beyond anything I had ever seen before. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, pinching the bridge of my nose, already exhausted by whatever ridiculous excuse she was about to throw my way. "What exactly did I do, Mom?" I asked, my voice calm and measured, because I already knew she wasn't calling to take responsibility. She was calling to play the victim. "You ruined his life," she cried, her voice dramatic enough to belong in a soap opera, her breath coming in short, exaggerated gasps, as if she had barely survived the catastrophe I had created. "You embarrassed him in front of everyone. You humiliated us. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I let out a slow breath, shaking my head, because it was actually insane to me that she still didn't get it, still didn't understand that this wasn't my fault, that this wasn't something I had done to them. This was something they had done to themselves. "You want to talk about embarrassment, Mom?" I asked, my voice steady, my patience thin. "You and Dad stole from me. Ryan lied to Emily. You covered for him. You expected me to just go along with it. And when I didn't, you got exposed. That's not my fault. That's yours." But she wasn't listening. She never did. "We are your family, Jack," she snapped, her voice shaking now, her desperation turning into anger, because she could feel that she was losing control. "Family helps family. Family forgives. You've always been so selfish, so bitter, so—" I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't bother arguing with someone who would never hear me, never truly see me, never acknowledge anything beyond her own twisted version of reality. I simply ended the call, set my phone down, and let them spiral without me. But Ryan wasn't done yet. Later that night, I heard a hard, frantic knock on my apartment door, the kind of knock that immediately tells you the person on the other side isn't here for a friendly chat. I opened it to find Ryan standing there, his face red, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body trembling with barely contained rage. "You think this is funny?" he spat, pushing his way inside, his entire frame tense with the kind of rage that only comes from a man who has never faced consequences in his life. "You think you can just ruin my wedding, destroy my relationship, humiliate me, and get away with it?" I let him rant, let him stomp around my apartment like a caged animal, Let him seethe and spit and throw his little tantrum, because that was all this really was, a tantrum. You took everything from me, he finally shouted, his voice cracking, his hands shaking, his eyes burning with misplaced fury. You should have just paid for the wedding. You should have just kept your mouth shut. But no, you had to make it about you, had to. I laughed. I actually laughed in his face, because the fact that he was still standing here, still completely incapable of understanding what had actually happened, still blaming me for the fact that his own actions had finally caught up to him, was just too much. I didn't take anything from you, Ryan, I said, stepping closer, watching as his confidence faltered, as the anger in his eyes flickered with something else, fear. You did this to yourself, and now you get to live with it. For a second, I thought he might actually swing at me, might actually lash out, might actually do something he'd regret. But then, just as quickly as the rage had filled his face, it disappeared, replaced with pure, pathetic frustration, his shoulders slumping, his jaw clenching, his fists relaxing. He wasn't going to fight me. He never was. Because in the end, Ryan was just as much of a coward as I had always known he was. The next morning, I woke up to one final message from my parents, one last attempt at wielding control, one last pathetic, desperate move to make me feel like I had lost something. Since you clearly don't care about this family anymore, my mother's message read, her tone cold, calculated, vindictive. You are no longer welcome in our home. Do not contact us again. We are cutting you off for good. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. They were cutting me off? They actually thought that was a threat? They actually believed they had anything left to take from me? I had never needed them, had never relied on them, had built a life for myself without a single ounce of their help. The only thing I had ever wanted from them was respect. And since they had never given it, there was nothing left to lose. So I sent back the only response they deserved. Good. Finally, something we agree on. And just like that, I was free. I watched as their world collapsed without me, as Ryan lost everything, as my parents fell deeper into debt, as the empire of lies they had built finally crumbled into dust. And me? I was happier than I had ever been in my life. But was it worth it? I'll let you decide. For the first time in my entire life, I felt free, truly and completely free in a way I had never experienced before, in a way I never even knew was possible, in a way that made me realize just how much weight I had been carrying for years without even recognizing it. There was no more expectation, no more obligation, no more feeling like I was just some walking, talking resource to be used and discarded whenever it was convenient for them. My parents had cut me off, had banished me from their lives, had told me in no uncertain terms that I was no longer welcome in their world. And yet, instead of feeling loss or regret or sadness, all I felt was relief. I didn't miss them. I didn't miss the guilt trips, the manipulation, the endless cycle of being taken for granted and then blamed whenever I refused to play along. I didn't miss the way my mother could twist any situation to make herself the victim. Didn't miss the way my father would look at me with nothing but thinly veiled disappointment. Didn't miss the way Ryan would act as though I was less than him, beneath him, nothing more than a stepping stone toward whatever luxury he felt entitled to next. In the weeks after the wedding disaster, I focused on my own life, on rebuilding what they had tried to take from me, on enjoying the simple, quiet, beautiful fact that I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. I poured my energy into my work, into my friendships, into building something for myself, something that had nothing to do with them, nothing to do with their expectations, nothing to do with their endless demands. And the more time passed, the more I realized that I had spent my entire life chasing something I was never going to get from them: validation, respect, love that wasn't conditional. Because the truth was, they had never really loved me. At least, not in the way a family is supposed to love. They loved what I could provide. They loved what I could do for them. They loved the idea of me as an extension of their needs. And when I stopped being useful, they threw me away. But just when I thought I had finally heard the last of them, just when I had fully accepted that I was better off without them, just when I was truly at peace with the fact that they had cut me off for good, I got a message. It was from my mother. It wasn't angry like before, wasn't furious or demanding or dripping with resentment the way her last message had been. No, this one was different, and that was exactly what made it so unsettling, so unnerving, so difficult to process. Jack, I know things got out of hand. I know we said things we shouldn't have. But at the end of the day, we're still family, and family should stick together. Your father and I would really love to see you. No expectations, no pressure. Just dinner. Just a chance to talk. We miss you. I stared at the message for a long time, longer than I probably should have, longer than I would have expected. I read it once, then again, then a third time, searching for hidden meaning, for manipulation, for some angle I wasn't seeing yet. And maybe that was the worst part. I didn't trust them anymore. A normal person, a normal son, would read a message like that and feel relieved, happy, hopeful. A normal person would see an olive branch, a chance for reconciliation, for healing, for something new and better than before. But all I saw was a test, a trap, an attempt to pull me back into the same toxic cycle I had fought so hard to escape. Because I knew them. I knew how they worked. I knew that if I showed up, if I walked through their door, if I gave them even the smallest inch of control, they would try to take everything from me all over again. And yet a small part of me still hesitated. Not because I believed they had changed. Not because I thought they were suddenly capable of being the parents I had needed them to be. Not because I wanted them back in my life. But because there was still a part of me, the child inside me, the teenager who worked 3 jobs just to prove he was worth something, the man who had spent his entire life waiting for his parents to finally see him. That part of me still wanted to believe there was something left to salvage. I sat there, my phone in my hands, my mind racing with 2 completely opposing thoughts. If I responded, if I agreed to meet them, if I let them back in, would that make me weak? Would that mean they had won? Would that mean all the progress I had made, all the strength I had built, all the lessons I had learned meant nothing? But if I didn't respond, if I ignored them forever, if I refused to even try, did that make me just as bad as them? Did that mean I was incapable of forgiveness, incapable of moving forward, incapable of being the bigger person? I didn't know the answer. I still don't know the answer. Maybe some people don't deserve forgiveness. Maybe some wounds never really heal. Maybe some families aren't meant to be repaired. Or maybe I just wasn't ready. I put my phone down without responding, without blocking her number, without making a decision at all. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that I didn't owe them an answer. Maybe I would respond one day. Maybe I never would. Maybe some bridges are meant to be burned, and maybe some should be left standing, even if you never cross them again. But the one thing I did know for certain, some people only love you when they need you. And me? I finally learned to stop needing them.